The Judas Cradle was a tall wooden frame with a pyramid-shaped wooden seat mounted at its apex. The victim was suspended above it by ropes looped under the arms and then lowered gradually until the point made contact. The entire body weight pressed downward from there. Guards would sometimes attach additional weights to the victim's feet and leave them suspended through the night to increase the pressure incrementally. Death, when it came, could take several days. I've placed this one near the bottom, not because it wasn't agonizing, but because the entries further down this list make it look almost forgiving by comparison. The Judas Cradle was a tall wooden frame with a pyramid-shaped wooden seat mounted at its apex. The victim was suspended above it by ropes looped under the arms, and then lowered gradually until the point made contact. The entire body weight pressed downward from there. Guards would sometimes attach additional weights to the victim's feet and leave them suspended through the night to increase the pressure incrementally. Death, when it came, could take several days. I've placed this one near the bottom, not because it wasn't agonizing, but because the entries further down this list make it look almost forgiving by comparison. The brazen bull was a hollow bronze statue cast in the shape of a full-sized bull, invented in ancient Greece by a craftsman named Perillus of Athens, who presented it to the tyrant Phalaris of Agrigentum as a gift. A door in the flank allowed a victim to be locked inside. A fire was then built beneath the statue. The bronze heated slowly and evenly from all sides, and the victim inside was roasted alive. Perillus had designed a series of pipes and tubes inside the neck so that the victim's screams would travel upward and emerge from the bull's open mouth, transformed into a sound resembling the bellowing of the animal itself. Phalaris reportedly tested the device on Perillus first. The crowd watching from outside saw only steam rising from the bull's nostrils. They heard only the bull. Bastinado consisted of beating the victim exclusively on the soles of the feet using a light rod, knotted cord, or cane. Unlike most flogging methods, it was designed specifically to cause pain without causing the kind of visible injury that would incapacitate the victim immediately. The feet contain a dense concentration of nerve endings and small bones, and repeated strikes produce swelling, fractures, and eventually an inability to walk. It was used widely across the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Asia as both a judicial punishment and an interrogation tool. I've placed this one low because it was rarely fatal and the sessions were usually brief. The damage to the small bones of the feet, however, was frequently permanent. The pillory was a wooden frame with holes that locked the head and wrists in place, forcing the victim to stand bent forward in a fixed position for hours or days in a public location. The physical discomfort of the position alone caused severe neck and back strain. The real danger came from the crowd. In England and colonial America, spectators were not only permitted to throw objects at the victim, but were often encouraged to do so. Rotten vegetables were common. So were rocks, dead animals, and human waste. Victims occasionally died from the injuries sustained from the crowd rather than from the device itself. The pillory was considered a mild sentence by the courts that issued it. Tarring and feathering was a public punishment where the victim was stripped to the waist or fully naked, and hot wood tar was either poured or painted across the exposed skin. Feathers were then thrown over the body, or the victim was rolled directly across a pile of them so they adhered to the tar. The burns from the tar alone caused permanent scarring. Removing the tar afterward tore away the skin beneath it. The victim was then paraded through the streets in this condition, intended to resemble a grotesque, oversized bird, as onlookers gathered to shout and follow the procession. I've placed this here because it wasn't typically fatal. The psychological damage and the permanent scarring were considered the point. The strappado was a method used extensively during the Inquisition across Spain, France, and Italy. The victim's hands were bound behind their back, and they were hoisted into the air by a rope attached to the wrists. At a certain height, the rope was released, dropping the victim toward the ground before being jerked to a stop just short of impact. The sudden arrest of the fall dislocated both shoulders simultaneously. In the weighted variant, heavy stones were tied to the victim's feet before the drop to increase the force on the joints. Sessions were recorded by notaries as legally sanctioned interrogation. Physicians were sometimes present to confirm the victim remained capable of continuing. The shoulders, once dislocated this way, rarely returned to full function. Keel hauling was a severe maritime punishment used primarily in the Dutch and English navies between the 15th and 18th centuries. The sailor was tied to a rope threaded beneath the ship and thrown overboard from one side. He was then dragged underwater along the full length of the hull from bow to stern, passing directly beneath the keel. The barnacles and marine growth encrusting the hull at the waterline functioned as a surface of densely packed razor edges. If the sailor did not drown during the crossing, and if the barnacles had not already opened wounds deep enough to cause fatal blood loss, the punishment was simply repeated. Most did not survive 2 passes. The ones who did were considered to have passed through something the Navy had no further word for. Roman decimation was the punishment reserved for military units that had disgraced themselves through cowardice, mutiny, or desertion in ancient Rome. A cohort of roughly 480 soldiers was divided into groups of 10. Each group drew lots. The soldier who drew the shortest straw was then beaten to death by the remaining 9 using clubs, stones, and fists. The 9 survivors were denied entry to the fortified camp and forced to sleep outside the perimeter for a designated period, eating only barley rather than the standard grain ration. The selection was entirely random, meaning soldiers who had fought honorably died alongside cowards. This was not a flaw in the design. It was the design. Every man in the unit was made equally liable regardless of individual conduct, which meant the fear of decimation extended to every soldier in every formation at all times. The rack was a rectangular wooden frame mounted on a slight incline with rollers at each end. The victim was laid flat on the frame with the wrists secured to one roller and the ankles to the other. A handle or lever was then turned to rotate the rollers in opposite directions, pulling the limbs away from the body simultaneously. The joints of the shoulders, elbows, hips, and knees separated in sequence as the tension increased. Ligaments tore, cartilage compressed and ruptured. In extended sessions, the limbs could be pulled entirely from their sockets, leaving the victim unable to stand or use their arms afterward. It was used primarily as an interrogation tool in England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire between the 13th and 17th centuries. Confessions obtained on the rack were considered legally valid in most jurisdictions that employed it. The Tower of London housed at least one permanent installation. Catherine's wheel was an execution method where the convicted person was spread across a large spoked wheel and tied at the wrists and ankles so that the limbs were stretched outward between the spokes. An executioner then worked through the body systematically with a heavy iron-tipped hammer, breaking the major bones in sequence: shins, thighs, forearms, upper arms, using the gaps between the spokes as a guide for each strike. The wheel was then raised on a post and left on public display. If the sentence specified mercy, the executioner delivered a final blow to the chest or throat at the end of the breaking. If it did not specify mercy, the victim was left on the wheel alive for as long as the body held. Birds were understood to be part of the sentence. It was used across France, Germany, and the Low Countries from the Middle Ages through the 18th century, and the raised wheel with a broken figure bound to it became a recognized symbol of civil authority in the regions where it was practiced most frequently. Blowing from a gun was a method of execution in which the condemned was tied directly across the mouth of a loaded cannon, typically with the abdomen or lower back positioned over the muzzle. The cannon was then fired. A description recorded by a British officer serving in India in the 19th century noted that the head traveled upward approximately 40 to 50 feet. The arms separated and fell at distances of roughly 100 yards to either side, and the legs dropped straight down beneath the muzzle onto the ground. I've placed this in the middle of the list rather than lower because, while death was instantaneous and the victim almost certainly felt nothing, the method was specifically designed to be witnessed. The destruction of the body was the message. It was used by the British colonial administration in India as a deterrent following uprisings, and by the Mughal Empire before them for similar purposes. The intent was never simply execution, it was erasure. Immurement was both an execution method and a form of lifelong imprisonment depending on how the sentence was applied. In its execution form, the condemned was sealed into an enclosed space, behind a newly constructed wall, inside a cavity in a building's foundation, within a sealed chamber, and left without food or water. Death came through dehydration, typically within 3 to 5 days, though starvation could extend the process considerably longer if water was somehow accessible. In its imprisonment form, a small opening was left through which food and water were passed regularly, and the person was simply left inside for the remainder of their natural life. Historical accounts of immurement appear across medieval Europe, the Byzantine Empire, Persia, and Japan. Nuns found guilty of moral offenses were immured in the walls of their own convents in several documented cases in 14th century France. The wall was built around them while they were still standing inside it. Sawing was used as an execution method in several distinct historical contexts, including ancient Rome, medieval Persia, and parts of East Asia. The victim was first suspended upside down by the ankles from a beam or frame. The inversion caused blood to flow toward the head, which kept the brain supplied with oxygen far longer than an upright position would allow, significantly extending the period of consciousness during the procedure. The executioner then began the cut at the groin with a large two-handled saw, working downward through the body in the direction of the head. The victim remained fully conscious through the initial stages of the cut. It is recorded that some survived as far as the saw reaching the navel before blood loss became fatal. The upside-down position was not incidental. It was the method's single, deliberate refinement, the one modification that turned a quick death into something measurably longer. Hanged, drawn, and quartered was the prescribed punishment for men convicted of high treason in medieval and early modern England and Ireland, and it was carried out in stages each intended to be distinct in its effect. The condemned was first tied to a wooden hurdle and dragged through the streets behind a horse to the execution site, arriving in a condition the crowd could already assess. He was then hanged by the neck, but cut down while still conscious. Before the drop could complete the process, his abdomen was opened and his intestines and genitals were removed and burned in front of him while he remained alive. He was then beheaded and the body divided into 4 parts. The head and quarters were subsequently displayed in prominent public locations. London Bridge and the city gates were favored sites, where they were left until they deteriorated. The sentence existed not only to kill, but to demonstrate, in the most literal available terms, that the state could reach the body of a traitor even after death and distribute it across the landscape as a form of extended warning. Flaying was the removal of skin from a living person, practiced as an execution method and as a form of torture across the Assyrian Empire, ancient China, medieval Europe, and pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. The skin, lacking major blood vessels, did not produce rapid blood loss when removed carefully, which meant the victim remained conscious through the early and middle stages of the process. An experienced executioner working with precision could remove significant portions of the body's surface while keeping the victim alive for an extended period. The Assyrian kings documented flaying in their military records as a standard consequence for captured enemy commanders and rebel leaders, and had the skins displayed on the walls of conquered cities. In some accounts, the skin was removed in a single, continuous piece. The process required skill. Cultures that practiced it regularly developed specific techniques, and the role of executioner in these traditions was a trained position rather than an improvised one. Lingqi, known in Western historical sources as death by 1,000 cuts, was a Chinese execution method used from roughly the 10th century until its abolition in 1905. The condemned was restrained, and a trained executioner made a long series of cuts across the body, each calibrated to penetrate deep enough to cause extreme pain, but not deep enough to sever a blood vessel large enough to produce rapid, fatal bleeding. In one documented variation, the executioner drew knives at random from a set, each marked with a body part: left forearm, right thigh, left foot, neck. and made the corresponding cut each time a knife was drawn, continuing until the knife marked with the heart was selected. In another variation, a fishnet was tied tightly around the victim's body, and the pieces of skin that protruded through the holes of the net were sliced away systematically. In the most severe recorded version, the victim was buried to the neck, a cross-shaped incision was made at the crown of the head, the skin was peeled back from the skull in 4 sections, and liquid mercury was poured directly into the wound. The mercury, being denser than tissue, worked its way downward between the skin and the flesh through its own weight. As the victim struggled to free themselves from the earth, the movement accelerated the separation. Those who managed to pull themselves free of the ground were documented as having left the skin of the scalp and upper face behind in the hole. Impalement in its most deliberately extended form involved positioning the victim onto a vertical stake that had been sharpened but not to a fine point, blunt enough that it did not immediately penetrate vital organs. The victim was set upright with the stake entering from below, and as long as he kept his full weight on his feet by standing on his toes, the penetration remained shallow. When the muscles of the legs exhausted themselves, the body descended slightly further onto the stake. The pain from the new penetration caused the victim to scramble upward again onto already failing muscles. This cycle repeated as the legs weakened progressively over hours, each collapse carrying the stake marginally deeper than the last, until something vital was finally reached. Vlad III of Wallachia, from whose documented practices the historical record of this method is most detailed, is reported to have had fields of thousands of impaled figures arranged outside the walls of cities as a greeting for approaching Ottoman forces. An Ottoman account from the 15th century recorded that the sight caused the advance column to halt without engaging. Scaphism was recorded by the Greek historian Plutarch, and is considered by a number of historians who have examined the account to represent one of the most prolonged methods of execution in the ancient record. The condemned was placed inside 2 wooden boats fitted together so that the arms and legs protruded through holes cut in the sides. Large quantities of milk and honey were forced into the victim by mouth until severe diarrhea resulted. The same mixture was then applied across the entire exposed surface of the skin. The vessel was floated on a stagnant pond or slow-moving body of water in a region with sufficient insect population. Flies, wasps, and other insects were drawn to the mixture on the skin and began feeding immediately. As days passed, the victim continued to be force-fed the same mixture each morning and the coating reapplied. The interior of the boat accumulated the victim's waste, which encouraged further insect activity and the development of larvae in the flesh. One account in the historical record specifies a survival duration of 17 days. The same account describes the victim's face as no longer distinguishable beneath the density of insects covering it, and notes that the flesh had begun to decay in the areas of deepest infestation, while the victim remained alive. The boat was never brought to shore until the process had concluded on its own terms. There was no mechanism for early termination built into the method. That was the method.